The story of the Winslow brothers does not begin with desire. It begins with absence. Their father, a stern but predictable man, died suddenly in a farm accident, the kind of accident that leaves nothing but rumors and silence in its wake. And into that silence stepped a new figure, their stepmother, a woman too young to carry the title, too fragile to wear the mask of mother, yet too cunning to be underestimated. She arrived as a caretaker, but she became something else, something that blurred the boundary between maternal warmth and forbidden temptation. At first, it was subtle, the brushing of a hand too long at the dinner table, a smile that lingered as if meant for more than one son, nights when she passed between their rooms like a shadow, as if testing the limits of decency. And the brothers, already damaged by grief, already drowning in the absence of their father's authority, did not resist. They watched. They entertained the possibility. And then they acted. But here's the horror most will not allow themselves to see. It wasn't only lust. It wasn't only weakness. It was control. It was a psychological pact, a blood oath forged in silence, that she would belong not to one but to both. A bond not written in marriage vows but carved into secrecy. They believed themselves chosen, ordained in corruption, liberated from law, morality, and consequence. And the deeper they went, the more invisible they became. Ask yourself this: why did no one in town notice? Why did the church turn a blind eye? Why did the neighbors only whisper, never accuse? Because society does not want to see what offends its foundation, because to expose such a truth would shatter the illusion of order. The truth is that communities thrive on silence, the silence of abused women, the silence of violated children, the silence of neighbors who suspect but cannot prove. Silence is the mortar that holds civilization's mask together. And so the Winslow brothers continued. By day, they were farmers, sons of the land. By night, they were something far darker. What happened in that house was not an affair. It was not an accident. It was a ritual of shared possession, a ritual that mocked the very concept of family. You were never meant to know this, and yet now you do. And knowledge once gained cannot be undone. Understand this. The Winslow brothers' pact was not an isolated sickness. It was a symptom of something older, something carved into the bones of power itself. Throughout history, those who rule, those who dominate, those who whisper in the dark, have always bent morality to serve desire. Incest, ritualized unions, secret exchanges of flesh, they are not accidents of rural madness. They are echoes of ancient corruption. Think of kings who married sisters to keep the bloodline pure. Think of emperors who claimed rights over brides before their husbands touched them. Think of cults, hidden in temples and forests, where sacred women were shared like offerings to bind men together in loyalty and control. The Winslows may have been farmers, yes, but they were also players in this older theater of corruption, whether they knew it or not. Their secret mirrored the rituals of priests, pharaohs, and patriarchs who used forbidden intimacy as a weapon of power. The woman at the center, their stepmother, was not simply desired. She was transformed into a vessel, a living bond. By sharing her, the brothers erased rivalry and forged complicity. One could never betray the other, because both carried the same secret. That is the true psychology of corruption. Not pleasure, but control. Desire is fleeting. Control endures. But here is the part that should make your skin crawl. Society itself benefits from these arrangements being buried. Institutions survive because they hide their rot. The neighbors, the church, the police. They saw glimpses, yes, but they preferred silence. Why? Because exposure would mean admitting that corruption does not live only in palaces and government halls. It lives in the farmhouse next door. It lives in the family you trust. It lives in the brothers who seem ordinary but carry rituals darker than death itself. And when truth is too unbearable, he is smothered, buried, forgotten, which is why stories like this remain in the shadows, whispered only when enough time has passed to dull the outrage. But you, right now, are dragging it back into the light. You are doing something dangerous simply by listening. Every forbidden truth is a test. Some look away, some cover their ears, but those who face it, those who dare to keep going, are changed. The Winslow brothers are only the doorway. What lies beyond is far worse. Listen close. This is where the mechanism reveals itself. What lived behind the Winslow farmhouse was not mere lust. It was an engineered system of psychological control. A quiet machine that converted shame into loyalty, confusion into obedience, and fear into ironclad silence. If you want to understand how institutions, families, churches, states protect their own, study how this household worked. It was simple, precise, and terrifyingly effective. First, normalization. The stepmother's slow transformation from outsider to instrument was dressed in ordinary gestures. A hand on a shoulder, an extra plate at supper, a bedtime that conveniently overlapped. Small acts, repeated, until the extraordinary felt like routine. Normalization is the anesthetic of atrocity. It turns revolt into resignation. You stop seeing the wrong because the wrong becomes the rhythm of your days. Second, mutual dependency. The brothers did not merely share lust, they shared fate. Each secret became leverage over the other. Each shared transgression created a bank of debt that could never be repaid. If one considered breaking the pact, to love someone else, to confess, to flee, the other held the memory like a debt note. You give me the secret, you owe me your silence. That debt is more binding than blood. Third, gaslighting and narrative control. Outside questions were met with practiced confusion. The brothers presented themselves as grieving sons, as caretakers, as pillars of the town. The stepmother smiled, baked pies for searchers, positioned herself between suspicion and the world like a human firewall. When whispers rose, they reframed them into gossip or jealousy. They turned accusation into embarrassment, complaint into character flaws. When truth threatens power, the first tactic is to deny the possibility of truth. Fourth, ritualization. These were not improvisations, but turns. Nights, spaces, and gestures repeated until they held the weight of a ceremony. Rituals create meaning where there is none. They sanctify the unsanctioned. The more ceremonial the abuse became, the harder it was to label, because labeling implied an outside standard. And the men who orchestrated it knew this. Make it sacred, and people will hesitate to desecrate it. Finally, community capture. The most dangerous move was turning neighbors and institutions into complicit actors, not necessarily by bribery or conspiracy, but through social inertia. People who benefit from the appearance of order look the other way. Officers who rely on reputation to keep a town calm will not poke at a respected family. The church that needs pews and donations will prefer silence over scandal. And so the machinery hums on. This is the anatomy of secrecy. It is methodical, it is clinical, and it is everywhere. Once you have seen one household operate like an apparatus of control, you will begin to notice the same patterns in other places where power must be preserved, in corporations, in monasteries, in political circles. Secrecy is not a mistake. It is a strategy. And strategies, when tasted, become tradition. Are you still with me? Good. We go deeper next, into the woman at the center, into the way desire and survival braided until neither could be told apart. Now we arrive at the core. The woman at the center, the stepmother, who became more than flesh and more than desire. To the outside world, she was a caretaker. To the church, she was a widow's successor, fulfilling her duty to hold together a broken household. But inside the farmhouse, she became a symbol, a weapon, a mirror of every man's shadow. Do not misunderstand. She was not simply a victim, nor was she simply a manipulator. She was both. Because in systems of corruption, people are not allowed to remain one thing. They are twisted until they are both prisoner and jailer, both offering and executioner. That is how power consumes. She learned quickly that intimacy could buy survival, that compliance could secure protection, and soon she discovered something darker, that her position allowed her to wield influence over both brothers, that she could pit them against one another while binding them together. By letting herself be shared, she controlled the flow of rivalry. By making herself the bond, she secured her place as indispensable. Think of the psychology. A woman who had lost her freedom, reinventing captivity as command. This is the double-edged sword of secrecy. When you cannot escape, you master the rules of the prison. And once you master them, you begin to rule those who once ruled you. She played their desires like strings, and in return, they clung to her as if she were the axis of their world. But what does this reveal about us, about humanity? That even in corruption, the architecture of hierarchy persists. Men convince themselves they control the object of desire. Yet in truth, the object, the woman, the possession, the forbidden, controls them. She dictates when they rise, when they fall, when they bend to hunger. The Winslow brothers became prisoners of the very arrangement they thought they had engineered. And still, no one outside suspected. To neighbors, she was simply modest, polite, devout. But those who watched carefully might have noticed her eyes, how they moved between the brothers with quiet calculation, how she always smiled at just the right time, silencing suspicion. She knew the greatest rule of all. In a world built on masks, the one who wears hers best survives the longest. This was no love triangle. This was no household accident. It was a living ritual, older than memory, reenacted in silence. And once you see it for what it is, you realize the Winslows were not alone. They were enacting a script written across centuries, a script that is always hidden behind locked doors and whispered prayers. Now we go further, because their corruption was not content to remain inside those walls. It bled outward, shaping lives, controlling fates, and leaving scars across a whole community. Secrets do not stay contained. They bleed. And when they bleed, they infect everything around them. The Winslow brothers' secret did not stop at the farmhouse walls. It reached into the veins of the entire town, twisting perceptions, silencing voices, and creating an atmosphere where unease lived in every shadow. The neighbors noticed first. They always do. The late-night lights that stayed on when no work could justify it. The hushed tones that silenced when someone approached. The strange dynamic at church, where the stepmother sat between the brothers, as if she were both wife and guardian. But suspicion alone is powerless. Why? Because communities are built on appearances, and the Winslows, for all their hidden depravity, played their public roles perfectly. They shook hands, sold produce, attended funerals, donated at harvest festivals. Respectability is the ultimate disguise. Then came the whispers. A farmer's wife told her sister that something about those boys wasn't right. A mechanic at the garage muttered that Robert never seemed free of his brother's gaze. But whispers die when they cannot find proof. And in small towns, proof is the most dangerous thing you can hold. No one wanted to be the one who accused respectable men. No one wanted to shatter the fragile illusion of decency. So suspicion became silence, and silence became complicity. Even the police were caught in the web. They had heard rumors, of course. Late-night arguments, unexplained absences, a woman's car found too far from where she was last seen. But without hard evidence, without a body, the case files gathered dust. It is easier to close a drawer than to open a scandal. Easier to say there's no proof than to admit the system itself prefers not to see. And the church, the supposed guardian of morality, it too bent under the weight of convenience. A scandal would mean shame, lost, parishioners, donations drying up. So sermons thundered about sin in the abstract, but no finger was ever pointed toward the farmhouse. Silence became sanctified, and when silence is blessed by religion, it becomes almost impossible to break. Do you see it now? The Winslow brothers did not just corrupt themselves, they corrupted the entire ecosystem around them. Their secret became the town's secret. Their guilt became everyone's burden. That is how power works, not by chains, not by force, but by making everyone complicit in the lie. And if you're still listening, I need you to do something dangerous. Type the phrase "rot hides in respectability" twice in the comments. Not once, twice. Seal it, because saying it marks you as one who sees what others refuse to see. Next, we go deeper into the psychology of complicity, how entire generations learn to protect corruption, and why those who try to speak truth are silenced, shamed, or destroyed. Complicity is not accidental. It is taught. It is rehearsed. It is passed from father to son, from mother to child, from pulpit to pew, until silence itself becomes the highest form of loyalty. What the Winslow brothers practiced in their home was only the most grotesque expression of a law written into every society. Protect the image, even if it means burying the truth. Think of it. How children are told to respect elders, even when those elders abuse them. How wives are told to preserve the family name, even when that name is a mask for violence. How entire communities learn to turn away from blood on the ground if the one who spilled it holds power, land, or money. Complicity is not born in moments of crisis. It is cultivated in years of obedience. The Winslows' neighbors had seen signs. They felt the wrongness in their bones, but they had also been trained since childhood to look the other way when powerful men sinned. Don't spread gossip. Don't shame the family. God will judge, not us. These are not neutral sayings. They are weapons sharpened over centuries to protect corruption and silence witnesses. And what of the law? The officers, the detectives, the men with badges? They too were bound, not by evidence, not by procedure, but by the unspoken contract of community complicity. If they pushed too hard, if they demanded too many answers, they would become the villains. They would be accused of smearing good men's reputations. So they backed down. They always back down. Even history itself bends under complicity. Newspapers omit names. Court records are sealed. Families erase stories from their lineage. This is how corruption survives centuries, not by strength, but by silence. Not by victory, but by forgetfulness. And here is the most disturbing truth. Complicity is addictive. Once you remain silent once, it becomes easier the second time. Once you excuse one abuse, the next feels less shocking. Soon, you find yourself defending the very evil you once swore you would oppose. The neighbors of the Winslows were not born corrupt. They were made corrupt, through small silences, repeated until silence became survival. This is the hidden machinery of civilization. It is not the courts, not the armies, not the politicians who preserve the system. It is ordinary people swallowing their voices day after day until no scream can be heard at all. And when you understand this, you see why forbidden history repeats, why corruption never dies, because every generation is trained to guard the mask instead of tearing it off. But what happens when the mask slips? What happens when a truth erupts so violently that silence cannot contain it? That is where the Winslow brothers' story turns, and where the descent deepens into chaos. Every mask eventually cracks. Even the strongest lies begin to bleed under the weight of time. For the Winslow brothers, the mask they had built, the mask of respectability, of control, of silence, began to splinter the moment outsiders brushed too close. And when masks slip, they do not fall gently. They shatter violently, leaving shards that cut everyone who tries to pick them up. It began with whispers that grew too sharp to ignore. A missing woman here, an argument overheard there, a car abandoned where it should not be. Each fragment, by itself, was dismissible, but together they painted a shape, the outline of something unholy. The townspeople still didn't dare accuse, but unease grew like mold in their voices. At church, glances shifted. At the market, conversations halted when the Winslows approached. Respectability is fragile. Once cracked, it spreads like a fracture in glass. Inside the farmhouse, the tension was worse. The stepmother, once the axis of their power, became a weight that pulled them into paranoia. Sharing her had united them once, but now it divided them. Who held her loyalty? Who whispered to her in the night? Who would betray first? The pact that had bound them now became the seed of their undoing. This is the paradox of corruption. What unites in secrecy eventually destroys in suspicion. The law, too, could no longer ignore the inconsistencies. Detectives noticed timelines that didn't align, statements contradicted by evidence, nervous glances, trembling hands, silences too long to be honest. The Winslows played their roles well, but cracks always appear when lies must be maintained too long. A mask cannot breathe. It suffocates the one who wears it. And then, the stepmother herself began to shift. No longer passive, no longer content to be the vessel of their control, she discovered her own hunger for survival. Did she speak? Did she confess? Did she manipulate the brothers into turning against each other? The records are scattered, the testimonies conflicting, but one truth remains. Her silence was no longer guaranteed. And once the silence of the center collapses, the whole machinery unravels. The community felt it before they saw it. The air thickened with rumor. Children were warned not to go near the farm. Friends avoided invitations. Even the church, that sanctuary of silence, began to retreat, distancing itself, praying without naming names. The Winslows, once untouchable, were now radioactive. Their corruption could no longer be hidden under rituals of politeness. The mask was slipping. The truth was leaking. And when truth leaks, it spreads like fire, uncontrollable, consuming, leaving no house untouched. The descent you are following now is not just about two brothers. It is about what happens when secrecy collapses and the beast beneath is exposed. That moment of exposure is both revelation and destruction, and it always costs blood. When secrets are pushed to the surface, violence is almost inevitable. The Winslow brothers' carefully orchestrated world could not withstand scrutiny, and the moment suspicion turned to investigation, chaos followed. The violence was not sudden, but insidious, a creeping force that first infected the household, then the surrounding town. What had been whispered now demanded attention, and attention is the enemy of secrecy. Inside the farmhouse, the tension metastasized into aggression. Fists slammed tables. Words became weapons sharper than knives. The stepmother, once the center of control, became a pivot around which rage and fear rotated. The brothers, bound by their pact but divided by paranoia, turned on each other in subtle ways first. A glare, a withheld explanation, a careless action that escalated into confrontation. The ritual of sharing had once created unity. Now it fueled fracture. Outside, the community felt the tremors. Farmers noticed the odd behavior, the arguments that escaped through thin walls, the menacing presence of the farmhouse looming over the fields. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now began to murmur, pushing against the weight of fear. But fear is sticky. It clings to the body and paralyzes action. Many who suspected could not intervene. They could not accuse. They could not testify. Silence had become their prison. Law enforcement, too, reached the edge of their patience. Detectives pieced together inconsistencies, contradictory timelines, and evasive testimonies. The missing woman, once a faint concern, became a symbol, a living question mark over a community that had willingly ignored the rot in its midst. And yet, the Winslows were clever, skilled at manipulating appearances, at bending perception, at gaslighting those who came too close. They knew every angle, every loophole, every weakness of the people around them. But no manipulation lasts forever. The stepmother's own survival instincts began to override allegiance to the pact. She maneuvered, threatened, and hinted at truths the brothers had hoped to remain buried. And in this triangle of desire, fear, and domination, violence became inevitable. Not just emotional or psychological, but physical, calculated, inescapable. This is the terrifying reality of forbidden knowledge. Once it touches the light, it no longer belongs to those who hid it. It spreads, it infects, it consumes. The Winslow brothers' secret, nurtured in silence for years, had now metastasized into a force that could no longer be controlled. Every attempt to suppress it only added fuel. Every lie, every act of complicity, every quiet nod from the town became part of the tinder, and fire, once lit, cannot be unlit. The consequences of forbidden knowledge are ruthless. For the Winslow brothers, the collapse of their secret was absolute. The very system they had constructed, the pact, the rituals, the manipulations, turned against them like a living predator. What had once bound them became a noose. What had once protected them became the instrument of their ruin. It began quietly. Small betrayals, overlooked or ignored for years, came rushing to the surface. The stepmother, once compliant, now demanded leverage. Threats whispered in the dark became open confrontations. The brothers, trained to manipulate and control, found themselves trapped in a web of suspicion, fear, and guilt. Every glance, every movement, every word could ignite an eruption. They were no longer masters, they were captives of the machinery they had built. The town's awareness, once latent, became unavoidable. Missing persons reports, rumors, and subtle hints coalesced into undeniable pressure. Neighbors who had turned away, afraid to confront the truth, began to confront each other instead, wondering who knew what and who had allowed it to continue. The cracks widened, and the facade of normalcy fractured. Ordinary conversations were now laced with fear, distrust, and accusation. Even the law, slow to act, began applying pressure, calling for statements, timelines, and accountability that could not be evaded. Inside the farmhouse, the tension escalated into physical violence. Objects were thrown, words became weapons sharp enough to wound bodies and minds. The stepmother's eyes, once calculating and calm, now burned with a combination of fear and fury. She had mastered the art of survival within the pact, but survival demanded action now, and action comes at a cost measured in broken bodies, shattered trust, and lives irreparably changed. The brothers themselves began to fracture. The younger, one, desperate for escape, considered confession, perhaps even flight. The older, bound by pride and fear, resisted, creating a collision course with inevitability. And in this collision, there could be no winners. The ritual of shared domination, the grotesque system that had defined their lives, finally demanded payment in blood, in secrets exposed, in the irreversibility of consequence. By the end, the Winslow empire of secrecy was gone. The household that once orchestrated desire, fear, and control became a theater of ruin, haunted by the echoes of the pact they had forged. And the town, the neighbors, the institutions, even the church, all bore witness to a truth they had preferred to ignore. They had been complicit, whether they realized it or not. And complicity, once recognized, leaves scars deeper than any weapon. The aftermath of the Winslow brothers' secret was more than tragedy. It was a lesson in the permanence of corruption. Even after the house fell silent, the echoes of their actions persisted, radiating through the town, leaving invisible scars on every person who had glanced at the truth and looked away. Communities remember more than they admit. Memories become shadows, whispers become cautionary tales, but few ever name the darkness openly, and that is how it survives. The stepmother vanished from the narrative, either by choice or by fate, but her presence remained imprinted on every life she touched. The brothers, stripped of their secret power, became shells of the men they had been. Their pride, their sense of invincibility, their authority, all evaporated under the weight of exposure. They were left with nothing but the consequences of desire, weaponized as control. The very machinery they had mastered now turned inward, consuming what little remained of their sanity. But the town also bore the cost. People who had been complicit, who had seen but not spoken, now carried guilt like an invisible brand. Trust was fractured. Innocence, once assumed, could never be restored. Even decades later, when children became parents, when new families settled the farmland, a subtle tension remained. Certain names were whispered in fear, certain houses avoided, certain histories left unexamined. This is how corruption perpetuates. It migrates quietly, hidden under normality, waiting for opportunity to flourish again. And the most terrifying part, this story is not unique. The Winslows' household was a microcosm, a mirror reflecting patterns repeated in countless families, organizations, and institutions across history: ritualized abuse, secrecy, shared complicity. These are tools of power, refined over centuries. The same forces that allowed the Winslows to operate undetected continue to function today, silently shaping human behavior, protecting abusers, and punishing the ones who try to speak truth. If you are listening, understand this. Knowledge itself is dangerous. Once you see the hidden mechanisms of control, you cannot unsee them. You cannot ignore how easily corruption embeds itself in ordinary lives. You cannot pretend that silence is neutral, because every act of silence empowers the same system that created the Winslows. Awareness is a weapon and a responsibility. So, before we reach the conclusion, reflect on what you have learned. Type the phrase, "rot hides in respectability" again, twice. Lock it in. This is not ritual nonsense. This is recognition. Recognition is the first step in breaking the cycle. Here, at the end of the descent, we confront the final truth. The Winslow brothers' story is not just horror or scandal. It is a mirror, a reflection of human nature, of the systems we build to hide corruption, and of the consequences when desire, secrecy, and power collide unchecked. The farmhouse is gone now. The voices are silent, but the lessons remain, etched into history, waiting for anyone willing to see beyond appearances. The most chilling part is not the acts themselves, but the machinery behind them. The normalization of sin, the pact of silence, the careful manipulation of perception. These are the tools that allow horror to exist anywhere. Institutions, communities, even families, they all have the potential to replicate this system if vigilance lapses. Respectability is a mask. Appearances are deceptive. And rot, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. And here is the final revelation. The Winslows were not monsters born in isolation. They were human, like anyone else. They were shaped by grief, opportunity, desire, and knowledge of how power protects itself. Their evil was ordinary in its mechanisms, extraordinary only in scale. That is why forbidden history matters. Because the same structures exist today in forms subtle, quiet, and invisible. What you refuse to see allows it to survive. What you name and confront diminishes its hold. You, listening now, are the witness. You have been taken behind the walls, into the rituals, into the shadows no one else will enter. That knowledge changes you. Awareness is your inheritance. Silence is optional, but complicity is not. Every time you encounter injustice, every time you see corruption hidden behind the veil of normality, remember the Winslows. Remember how easily fear and desire intertwine, how communities protect predators, and how truth, once buried, can erupt in devastation. The horror is not over. It never truly is. History repeats. Secrets are waiting. The question is whether you will let them repeat, or whether you will see, speak, and act. The Winslow brothers' story is gone from headlines, but it is not gone from the world. It exists in the cracks, in the whispers, in the silence of those who look away. And now, it exists in you. The descent ends here, but the awakening, that is only beginning.